Welcome to the Wrestling Realm Presents Championship Culture. I'm Brandon the Guy, and remember, every bout has a story. Now, before we get into today's content, I just want to remind you of a couple of things. You know that you can watch any of the Wrestling Realm content at any time just by going on youtube.com/The Wrestling Realm. Follow us on all social media platforms on Twitter, Facebook, with the handle @The Wrestling Realm. Don't forget to like or subscribe so you never miss a chance for when we go live and engage in the conversation. You can also stream and download all of our audio content on Anchor, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, and you can also watch the Twitch channel @The Wrestling Realm. Now, today's is all about, does size matter? When it comes to belts, I'm going to be honest with you, this is when it actually does. Belts come in all different sizes, but to understand the sizes, you got to understand the logic behind it. There's 1 millimeter, 2 millimeter, 3 millimeter, 4 millimeter. There's also brass and zinc. Of course, they have different weight. Today, I'm going to talk about just the zinc belts, and I want you to see the difference in the 2 millimeter versus 3 millimeter or 4 millimeter. I personally don't own any 1 millimeter because I feel like if you're buying a 1 millimeter belt, it might be too flimsy and it might bend. Because some 2 millimeter brass are actually very easy to bend and shape and mold, and it might become warped. So I always stick with 2 millimeter on up. Oftentimes, when it comes to order the belt, you'll have the maker ask you, what size do you want? If you're going to stack it, if you are going to have a larger plate, it depends on what it is. It might be your preference. But I'm going to show you a belt, and then I'm going to break it down for you and show you why I had this belt. Now, every belt has a story, so let me give you this one. When AEW first was in its infancy, and when Chris Jericho was crowned as the first champion, anybody that knows me know I'm a Jerichoholic, so of course I had to get this belt. I didn't want to spend the $500-600 that it was, so I opted to get a 2 millimeter. Had I known what I'd known, I would have got at least a 2 millimeter quadruple stacked. And you'll see in my next couple shots, you'll see what I mean by the multiple stacking of the belt, because that always comes down to the size matter. Within this belt, you can see that it's only 2 levels to it, but it's very thin because it's only 2 millimeter. And on the actual AEW belt, the silver portion on version 1 was actually a stack on top of it. So it was a base plate on the gold outline, and then there was a stacked silver part. But let's take a look at the other belt and you'll see the difference. So clearly, just with the over the shoulder, you can see a huge difference. This belt has a bigger curve, and it has a lot more attention to detail. By far, if I was carrying it to a show, I would refuse to carry this one because this belt weighs over 10 pounds. This belt easily about 4 to 6 pounds because it doesn't have the stack and it doesn't have the weight that this one has. When we talk about does size matter, one of the main things I want you to realize that when you start to get a belt stacked, 4 millimeter stacked, it's going to be way too much. I don't know if you can see. Even just from where the nameplate is, you got 1, 2, 3, and then at its height 4, because each level is based upon the next. So just to show you a glimpse, this is still version 2 of it. The difference is the world title on version 3, when they changed it to the gold, version 3 of it had the world spelled different and champion was spelled a little different. But when you look at it, they came out with a couple different versions of this belt, and I think they settled on version 3, and it could be considered version 2 because that's when they changed the second plate of this being gold. The story behind this belt was I wanted to upgrade. Oftentimes I will upgrade. Sometimes you buy a 2mm and then you find yourself later on going to a 3mm or 4mm. But I wanted something as close to the replica as possible at the time. And that's why I wound up getting a 4mm stack belt, which is way too heavy. It is pretty, but it's just too much belt to be carrying, too much belt to be displaying, too much belt to even have around, because I'm not going to do anything with this but have it either in a display case or have it laid out for people to see when they come visit. But let me dive into another belt just to give you a different example. Check these pictures out. Now, I know these were two different, not necessarily eras, but two different versions of a tag team. But I really wanted to show you the comparison of a 2mm that wasn't stacked, and then this is a 4mm that's not stacked either. It seems like that the details of the 4mm are just out there more. And even with the 2mm, because this is the first ROH belt, you can still see the details in the side. So as you can actually see, it says ROH. You can actually see the sunburst behind it. You can even see the floral pattern behind it. But the detail lies when it's a thicker plate. So when you look at the 4mm of these, that's why I wanted to show the comparison of them. So on a single stack, I would always go with 4mm. Single stack, nothing else, just a basic belt, always going to be 4mm for me. It's a good weight. It doesn't feel like it'll bend or break. You usually get stronger posts in the back, and the posts are basically this portion back here. Whenever makers usually do 4mm, it's like a stronger post. It feels a little thicker, and because this has a belt tip, it doesn't outweigh the fact of the belt being 4mm. I feel like it's a lot easier to handle. Yes, the leather on the 2mm is a downgrade of this leather, but I will tell you, 4mm for the basic and 2mm if you're trying to save a couple dollars. The difference in the price might be anywhere between as little as $20 up to $100, depending on who your maker, how much you're willing to spend, and what level of detail do you want. Because some people opt to get croc backing, some people get different type of tooling on the side. As long as the leather is floppy and this is close to what we saw in the ring, I'm okay with it. So the story behind this belt, during the Du Burns Arena time and during the time when, you know, ROH was at its peak, I remember this belt because I feel like this belt has a lot of classic history behind it. Feel like I couldn't be an ROH fan without this one, and I do have other ROH tags, but I feel like this was one of the first ones that I brought because it takes me back to the Du Burns Arena and seeing this belt being defended. And I'll even go one further. This logo, to me, feel like it was the Du Burn era of ROH, and then of course they evolved it. But being an ROH fan early on, this belt to me just felt like it screamed, I'm the most important thing in that division. So of course I had to add it to the collection. With all that being said, I just want you to think about a couple things when it comes to 2mm versus 4mm. WWE shop belts are going to be 4mm or above unless they put it in the description it's a 2mm like they did with the big gold. Even with this United States title, it was 2mm when they came out with the actual scratch logo. Then the cleaner one became 4mm. As they start to evolve and they start to take over with a new maker, it seems like they start to get heavier and heavier, and they start to make it thickness, but they might be hollow. And I'm gonna give you an example of what I mean by the thickness and what I mean by hollow. Check out these two belts and you'll see exactly what I mean. So even though this is a monster belt, it's still heavy. I've seen where people have taken this apart and this center plate is hollow. So yes, from the base, it could be about 6 millimeters, but the fact is it's not heavy to the point that even with my 4 millimeter double stack, I would prefer to carry this belt or the IC belt because it's a thicker belt, but it doesn't have the weight that's going to deter me from throwing it over my shoulder, putting it around my waist, carrying it to a show, or even displaying it any way that I want to, because the hollow out of the center plate doesn't hurt the belt, but it still looks good. And I don't know if a lot of people can really appreciate the belt. It's not necessarily stacked. It looks like the Champion is actually made onto it. So you could argue it's stacked. You could argue that it's, you know, raised, but even with the Eagle, it's just a raised portion of it. So even with this thickness of this belt, it's still a lot easier to manage than a 4 millimeter stacked blade that I have in my AEW belt. So keep that in mind when it comes to WWE Shop. It might say 6 millimeter thick, it might be hollowed out. I can speak for this one and the new version of the Intercontinental. Those two belts have a lot of hollowed out points, but they are thick, they are heavy, they do have some weight, but they're not discouraging to carry. There you have it. Hope that helps, that you can understand the difference in 2 millimeter and 4 millimeter. I will say that the Wrestling Realm tag belts are 4 millimeter single stacked. There's nothing raised on them. They're basic 4 millimeter belts because I wanted to make sure they were a decent size and they were easy to carry. Oftentimes, some people want to go for the heaviness, and the heaviness, I went for functional. I think the 4 millimeter helped with the details. I don't know if anybody ever really catch that the middle of it is the Wrestling Realm and is etched into the center plate. It's not stacked at all, nor is the Raven that inspired Al Bird in the middle and the globe. This is all one plate, and it's all made to be etched into one, so that way we wouldn't have to stack it, because when you get to stacking, that's where it gets a little heavy. So to be honest with you, if it was my preference, the size does matter depending on what you want to do with it. For display purposes, go with that 4 millimeter stack, or do like I did with my United States belt. I got it 3 millimeter stacked because I tried to scale back a little, but guess what? That sucker still weighs about 10 to 12 pounds. So 2 millimeter stacked belt to carry to a show would be better. 4 millimeter, better for display. So until next time, remember, every belt has a story. I can't wait to hear yours.